Welcome to Relaxing Revenge Storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight's story is a real treat.
My name is Denise Flynn. I'm 28 years old, and 3 Saturdays ago, I stood behind a microphone at my own clinic's open house. 130 people holding paper plates of cake and sweet tea in the late Beaufort afternoon. And I pressed play on 2 audio recordings that ended my parents' careers, their marriage to this community, and every lie they'd spent 7 years building on top of my name. My 3-legged pit bull sat beside the podium the whole time, his chin on his one front paw, like even he knew there was nothing left to do but let the truth make it sound. What I haven't told anyone yet is what my father's face did when he heard his own voice come through those speakers. Not shame, not surprise. Something worse. Recognition. Like a man watching himself on a security camera doing the thing he swore he never did. If you've ever had someone use your credentials, your labor, your name to build something the world thinks belongs to them, and then try to destroy you when you dared build something of your own, stay with me. Because this story ends with the room going silent and my mother trying to leave through the side gate. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who finds yourself in these stories, who recognizes the ache behind the telling, I'd ask you to hit subscribe and stay with this channel. We tell stories here about quiet people who stop being quiet, not because they want attention, because the silence was killing them. Drop a comment if you've ever been the only one who knew the truth about someone everyone else admired. I want to know what that felt like for you. And if this hits somewhere personal before it's over, just know you're in the right place. Now, to understand what happened at that open house, you have to go back 7 years. To the worst decision I ever made disguised as the best phone call I ever received. I was 21 and finishing my first year of a veterinary residency at NC State, full ride. My cohort was 12 people chosen from over 400 applicants, and I was one of 3 who'd been offered guaranteed placement in a specialty surgical program upon completion. I had a studio apartment in Raleigh with a window that overlooked a parking lot, and I thought it was the most beautiful view in the world because it was mine. I ate ramen 4 nights a week and practiced suturing on bananas, and I was happier than I had ever been in my life. Then my mother called. She was crying. Not the polished, performative crying I would later learn to identify, but the kind that sounds like someone drowning. She said the practice was struggling. She said my father's back was giving out. She said they needed me, that the family needed me, that everything they had built for 30 years was going to collapse if I didn't come home and help hold it together. She said, "You're our little doctor, Denise. You always were. Come home and we'll make you a partner. Your name on the door. Flynn and Flynn." Flynn and Flynn. I'd been imagining that sign since I was 12 years old, standing on a step stool in their surgery suite, watching my father remove a tumor from a golden retriever spleen with hands so steady they looked mechanical. My mother running the front desk, knowing every client's name, every pet's birthday, every family story. They were good at what they did. And I believed, with the complete credulity of a daughter who loved her parents, that they wanted me beside them because I was good too. I withdrew from the residency. My advisor, Dr. Paulson, sat me down in her office and said, "Denise, you're making a mistake." I told her my family needed me. She said, "Your family has a practice. You have a future. Those aren't the same thing." I didn't listen. I packed my studio apartment into my Honda Civic, drove 4 hours south to Beaufort, South Carolina, and walked into my parents' clinic on a Monday morning in August, expecting to see my name on a partnership agreement. There was no agreement, not that week, not the next. When I asked, my mother said, "Let's get you settled first, honey. The paperwork can wait." My father said less. He'd always said less. He operated in silences and sighs that my mother translated into whatever narrative she needed at the time. They gave me a title, trainee. I was a fully licensed veterinarian. I had passed my boards. I had a DEA registration for controlled substances. I was not a trainee in any legal, professional, or practical sense of the word, but that's what they put on the pay stub. And the pay stub said $31,000 a year. I want you to hold that number, $31,000. For a licensed veterinarian performing surgeries, managing controlled substance logs, seeing patients solo 3 days a week while my father took long lunches and my mother attended church committee meetings. $31,000 for a woman who left a full ride residency to come home. Here's what I didn't know during that first year. The practice was billing under my license number, my DEA registration, my credentials. every surgery I performed, every medication I dispensed, every patient I saw, the billing went through my professional identity and the revenue went into their account. $74,000 in billings under my name. I saw $31,000 of it. The other $43,000 went into an account I didn't know existed, attached to a practice that had my license number on every controlled substance log but my name on nothing else. I found out because of a tax form. A 1099 showed up at my apartment showing income of $74,000, income I never received. I sat on my kitchen floor with that piece of paper and a calculator and did the math 3 times because I was sure I was wrong. I wasn't wrong. My parents had billed the state, the insurance companies, and our clients using my credentials and kept the difference. When I brought the form to my mother, she laughed, actually laughed. She said, "Honey, that's a clerical error. Your father handles the books. I'll have him fix it." She never mentioned it again. When I brought it up a second time, my father looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You live rent-free in this town because of our name. You eat dinner at this table 3 nights a week. Don't start counting pennies, Denise. It's ugly." That was the first time I understood that the ledger between my parents and me was not a ledger of love. It was a ledger of debt, and they intended to keep me on the owing side forever. Year 2 was when Kaylee arrived. Kaylee was 24. She was not a veterinarian. She was not a veterinary technician. She was not licensed or credentialed in any capacity related to animal medicine. What Kaylee was the daughter of my father's girlfriend. I didn't know he had a girlfriend. My mother knew. I found this out the way I found out everything in that family. Accidentally, too late, and with a physical sensation like stepping off a curb that isn't there. My father added Kaylee to front desk operations. Fine. Except within 3 months, Kaylee was introducing herself to pharmaceutical reps as the daughter joining the practice. My father was telling suppliers the same thing. Not me. Kaylee, the unlicensed 24-year-old whose mother was sleeping with my father, was being positioned as the future of a practice that ran on my license. And my mother, who knew all of this, said nothing. She smiled at Kaylee across the front desk. She brought Kaylee coffee. She corrected Kaylee's filing with the patient warmth of a mentor. Because my mother understood something I was only beginning to grasp. The practice was not a family business. It was a performance. And every person in it had a role to play. And my role was to work, to bill, to generate, and to remain silent about the terms. I stayed. I want you to understand that I stayed. And I want you to understand why. Because if you've never been inside this particular trap, the staying looks like weakness. But the trap works like this. Everything you have, everything you've built, everything you've sacrificed is inside the cage. Your license is attached to their billing. Your clients know you through their practice. Your professional reputation exists within their ecosystem. Leaving means starting from zero in a town where your parents are beloved, and they were beloved. My God, were they beloved. My mother volunteered at Grace Lutheran every Wednesday. She organized the Beaufort Pet Adoption Fair every spring. She brought casseroles to new neighbors and remembered every birthday and answered the phone at the clinic with a voice so warm you'd think you were calling your own grandmother. My father was quieter, but no less effective. He coached Little League for 6 years. He donated free veterinary services to the county animal shelter. He stood at community dinners and shook hands like a man running for office, and everyone in Beaufort who had ever brought a sick cat or an injured dog to Flynn Veterinary Associates would tell you the same thing. Those are good people. Those are good people. I heard it from the mail carrier. I heard it from the woman at the bank. I heard it from my landlord who told me once, "You're lucky to have parents like that, Denise. Not everyone gets that kind of support." I was standing in his office paying my rent with a check drawn on an account that was $43,000 lighter than it should have been, and he told me I was lucky. That was the year my mother went to a veterinary conference in Charleston and ran into 2 of my former professors from NC State. She told them I had decided private practice wasn't for me. She told them I was exploring other options. She told them this at a cocktail reception, holding a glass of white wine, wearing the pearl earrings I'd given her for Mother's Day with money I earned under a license she was billing without my knowledge. My mentor, Dr. Paulson, called me the following week. She said, "Denise, your mother told me you've left clinical work. Is everything okay?" And I sat on my apartment floor for the second time with a phone in my hand and realized that my parents were not just stealing my labor. They were erasing my professional existence. They were telling the world I wasn't a real veterinarian while using my real veterinary license to fund their lives. That was the night I opened my laptop and started reading my parents' billing software. What I found in that billing software changed everything I thought I knew about my own career. 5 years of controlled substance logs, 5 years of surgical records, 5 years of DEA registered dispensing authorizations, every single one bearing my license number. Procedures I never performed, patients I never saw, controlled substances dispensed on days I wasn't even in the building. My parents had been operating under my credentials like a coat they borrowed and never returned, and the coat was getting heavier every year, and I was the one who'd be buried in it when the weight finally collapsed. Year 4 was when my father refinanced their house. I found out because a loan officer called me to verify employment. My name was listed on the loan application as staff veterinarian with a salary figure I'd never earned, attached to a revenue projection based entirely on billings generated under my license. My father had used my professional identity to secure a mortgage without telling me, without asking me, without a single moment of hesitation. When I confronted him, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not guilt, calculation, like a man measuring whether a tool still has use left in it. He said, "You want to make this a legal thing, Denise? You want to hire a lawyer against your own parents? Go ahead, but remember who taught you everything you know." And then he said, the thing I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "Without this practice, you're just a girl with a piece of paper." Just a girl with a piece of paper, my veterinary license, the credential I'd spent 8 years earning, the thing they'd been billing under for half a decade. To him, it was a piece of paper. To him, I was just a girl holding it. That was the breaking point. Not because it was crueler than anything before it, but because in that sentence, I heard the entire architecture of how my parents saw me. Not as a colleague, not as a daughter they were mentoring, as a resource, a credential with legs, a license number that generated revenue and asked too many questions. I went home that night and looked at the lease for a storefront 11 miles away on the other side of Beaufort, a rented space in a strip mall between a laundromat and a sandwich shop, 1,200 square feet, no surgical suite, no recovery kennel, no reputation, just empty floor and fluorescent lights and a rent I could barely afford. And I signed the lease the next morning. Opening my own clinic was the loneliest thing I've ever done. I had $6,000 in savings, a used examination table I bought from a retiring vet in Hilton Head, and a 3-legged pit bull I pulled from the euthanasia list my first week because the shelter said he was unadoptable and I was standing in an empty clinic with no patients and a dog who needed someone to believe he was worth saving. His name is Brutus. He was missing his front left leg from a trauma no one could explain, and he looked at me from the shelter kennel with an expression that said, "I know what it's like to be discarded. Take me with you." So I did. He slept in the clinic with me those first weeks. I set up a cot in the back office and Brutus lay beside it, his chin on his one remaining front paw, and I listened to the strip mall settle at night and wondered if I'd made the worst decision of my life. I hadn't, but my parents were about to make sure it felt that way. Within 2 weeks of my clinic opening, my parents started calling my clients, not their clients, mine. The handful of people who had followed me from their practice, who trusted me specifically, who brought their animals to me and not to the Flynn name. My parents called them and told them my facility had failed inspection. It hadn't. My parents told them I was operating without proper permits. I wasn't. My parents told them things that were specific enough to sound credible and vague enough to be difficult to disprove, and they told them with voices full of concern, full of worry, full of parental anxiety about a daughter who was in over her head. 3 clients left. I remember each of their names. I remember the dogs they brought and the cats they carried and the apologetic tone in their voices when they called to cancel. They said things like, "We just want to be safe," and we heard some concerns, and maybe once things settled down. Things were never going to settle down. My parents weren't going to let them settle down. Then came the anonymous complaint to the State Veterinary Board, filed by someone alleging that my controlled substance logs were falsified, that I was dispensing medications without proper documentation, that my DEA registration was being used improperly, anonymous. Except the board's investigation system has an email notification feature, and the complaint had been filed from an email address I recognized. My father's personal Gmail, not anonymous at all, just arrogant. He hadn't even bothered to create a fake account. The investigation lasted 90 days. 90 days during which my practice was technically under review. 90 days during which I couldn't apply for certain insurance panels. 90 days during which the word investigation followed my name like a shadow in a small town where everyone talks and no one forgets. The board cleared me completely. every log was perfect, every dispensation was documented. Every controlled substance accounted for to the milligram. Because I am not a girl with a piece of paper. I am a veterinarian who keeps meticulous records because I was trained by people who kept meticulous records, even if those people turned out to be the ones trying to destroy me with the very skills they taught me. My mother's next move was digital. She created a Facebook page called Beaufort Pet Safety Alerts. Anonymous, of course. Community service, of course. And among the posts about local wildlife warnings and pet recall notices was a post stating that a Beaufort veterinary clinic was currently under state investigation for unsafe practices. She didn't name my clinic. She didn't have to. In a town with 3 veterinary practices, the math was simple. 3 more clients left. But here's the thing about trying to destroy someone in a small town. The same intimacy that makes the rumors effective also makes the defense personal. A local rescue group, Low Country Paws, posted a response defending my clinic by name. They described the free spay and neuter services I'd provided. They described the emergency surgeries I'd performed for rescued animals at 2 a.m. for no charge. They described Brutus, the 3-legged pit bull I'd pulled from death and who now greeted every client who walked through my door with a tail that never stopped. 14 new clients came in that month, more than I'd lost total. And that was when I began to understand something about my parents' strategy. They were fighting with lies. I was building with labor and labor compounds. Labor is visible. Labor sits in a clinic at 2 a.m. with a terrier named Biscuit, who belongs to a 71-year-old woman named Mrs. Adwell, and labor saves that terrier's life when his intestine perforates and no one else in Beaufort will answer the phone. Mrs. Adwell. I need to tell you about Mrs. Adwell because without her, the story I'm telling you might have ended differently. Lucille Adwell, 71, retired county clerk, lifetime member of Grace Lutheran Church, and for the first 5 years of this story, a devoted admirer of my mother. Linda Flynn and Lucille Adwell sat on the church hospitality committee together. They organized potlucks, they arranged flowers. They were the kind of church friends who call each other hon and mean it. When Mrs. Adwell needed her 2 dogs boarded, my mother suggested she bring them to me. Denise does boarding now, my mother said with the charitable tone of a woman helping her struggling daughter find work. Mrs. Adwell boarded her dogs with me for 3 years. I never charged her a dime. Not because I was desperate for clients, though I was. Because she was 71 and living on a fixed income, and her dogs were the only family she had in Beaufort, and I am a veterinarian, and that is what veterinarians do. Then Biscuit got sick. A Sunday night, 11 p.m. Mrs. Adwell called me in tears. I drove to the clinic in pajama pants and surgical clogs, and I spent 4 hours in surgery saving her dog. I didn't charge her. I sent her home with antibiotics and pain medication and a follow-up appointment and a hug in the parking lot at 3 a.m. The following Wednesday, Mrs. Adwell went to church. She found my mother arranging lilies in the fellowship hall. She tried to thank her for raising such a generous daughter. My mother's response, delivered while trimming lily stems with kitchen shears, was this: Denise only did that because she's desperate for clients. Mrs. Adwell told me this 3 days later, sitting in my clinic's waiting room with Biscuit on her lap. She said, I've known your mother for 12 years, Denise, and I've never heard anything that ugly come out of her mouth. Then she said, what else has she been saying? I told her everything, not strategically, not carefully. I told her the way you tell someone the truth when you've been holding it so long your arms are shaking. The billing, the license, the fake complaint, the Facebook page, the clients they called, all of it. And Mrs. Adwell, 71 years old, retired county clerk with 30 years of experience handling public records and documentation, looked at me across the waiting room and said, do you have proof? I had proof. I had the 1099 showing the income discrepancy. I had the billing records showing my license number on procedures I never performed. I had the email proving my father filed the board complaint. I had screenshots of the Facebook page. I had the board's letter clearing me completely. And I had something else, something I hadn't fully understood the value of until that moment. When I set up my clinic, I installed a VoIP phone system. Voice over Internet Protocol. Every call made from or received by my clinic phone was automatically logged and recorded. It was a standard feature of the business package. I'd chosen it because it let me review client calls for accuracy. I mentioned it to no one because it was unremarkable. It was just how the phone system worked. But here's what I didn't anticipate. My father, during one of his visits to my clinic, the kind of visit where he'd walk through slowly, inspecting, criticizing, performing the role of concerned parent, evaluating his daughter's little project, during one of those visits, he used my clinic phone to make a call. He called my biggest boarding client, and on that call, logged and recorded by a system he didn't know existed, he told her that I practiced without insurance, that my coverage had lapsed, that she was putting her animals at risk by leaving them with me. He said it casually, warmly, with the voice of a man who was just looking out for her best interests, and my phone system captured every word. I also had my mother's voicemails, everyone, including a voicemail from November 2024 in which she said, and I can quote this from memory because I've listened to it approximately 400 times, "Sweetheart, we are so proud of your little clinic. You're doing amazing." And I had a recording of a call she made to the county licensing office in January 2025, 2 months later, in which she said, "I need to report that my daughter, Denise Flynn, is operating a veterinary clinic without current malpractice coverage. She's a liability to this community." The same mouth, the same woman, 2 months apart, proud of your little clinic. She's a liability to this community. If you played those recordings side by side, which I was about to do, you could hear the exact frequency at which love and destruction share a voice. My hands were shaking before I opened the board's letter that came 8 weeks before the open house. I was sitting at my desk with Brutus pressed against my leg like he knew. The letter confirmed what I'd suspected. The state board had received my formal inquiry about my parents' clinic. 5 years of controlled substance logs bearing my license number on procedures I never performed. The board had opened a mandatory compliance audit. My parents' clinic had 90 days to respond. That 90-day window expired the week of my open house. The open house, my clinic's 3rd anniversary celebration. I'd been planning it for months. A ribbon cutting, a facility tour, refreshments, a chance for the community to see what I'd built. But now, the open house was becoming something else. It was becoming the stage. Mrs. Adwell and I met 4 times in the weeks before the event. She was methodical in a way that reminded me she'd spent 30 years as a county clerk processing legal documents and public records. She said, "I don't do family business, Denise. I've made it 71 years by keeping my nose in my own lane." I told her I understood. I told her I wouldn't ask her to get involved, and then she called me the next morning and said, "I called 6 of your clients yesterday. 3 of them got calls from your mother, 2 got calls from your father. They all said the same thing. Your clinic is unsafe." She paused. "I'm involved now." Mrs. Adwell spent 3 weeks collecting statements, not gossip, statements. Written, signed, dated documents from clients who had received false reports from my parents about my practice. 22 clients in total. 22 people who Linda and Gerald Flynn had personally contacted with fabricated safety concerns about their own daughter's veterinary clinic. Mrs. Adwell compiled them into a folder with the same precision she'd once used for county records. She paper-clipped each statement. She organized them by date. She made 2 copies. I sent invitations to the open house. I invited clients. I invited the Low Country Paws Rescue Group. I invited local business owners. I invited the Beaufort Gazette because a small animal clinic's 3rd anniversary is exactly the kind of community interest story a local paper covers. And I invited 2 state veterinary board inspectors because I wanted them to see my facility, my records, my controlled substance logs, and my license, current, active, and unblemished, hanging on the wall in a frame I bought with my own money. I also invited my parents. I sent them the same invitation I sent everyone else. Blue cardstock, embossed lettering, the clinic logo Brutus helped me design, which is to say, he stepped on the printout while it was drying and left a paw print that I incorporated into the final version. My mother RSVP'd within 2 hours. "We'd love to come, sweetheart. So proud of you." So proud of you. The exact words from the voicemail. The one I was about to play in front of 130 people. 2 months before the open house, my mother arrived at my clinic carrying a pot of homemade chicken soup. She walked in with the warmth of a woman making amends, and she set the soup on my desk and said, "I wish we could start over, honey." She looked at Brutus on his bed in the corner and said, "That dog loves you. Everybody can see that." She stayed for 20 minutes. She asked about my clients. She complimented my exam room organization. She hugged me when she left, and her perfume smelled like safety, which made it worse. The following Monday, she called the county licensing office and filed the malpractice coverage complaint. 3 weeks later, I'd understand why she brought that soup, but that Tuesday I almost believed her. The morning of the open house, I woke at 5. Brutus was already awake, his tail thumping against the floor, which is his way of saying he knows something is happening, even if he doesn't know what. I showered. I dressed in the navy blazer I'd bought specifically for this event and a white blouse I'd ironed the night before. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at myself the way you look at someone you're about to ask to do the hardest thing they've ever done. I checked the audio files one more time. 2 recordings saved on my phone, backed up on a USB drive in my blazer pocket, backed up again on a laptop in the clinic office. I'd listened to them so many times I could hear them without pressing play. My mother's voice saying sweetheart and my mother's voice saying liability, back to back, like a woman arguing with her own echo. I checked the folder Mrs. Adwell had prepared. 22 signed statements, 2 copies, 1 in my bag, 1 locked in my desk. I drove to the clinic at 7. The caterers arrived at 9. The tables went up in the parking lot, which I'd rented from the strip mall for the day. White tablecloths, trays of finger sandwiches and sweet tea, and a cake shaped like a paw print that one of my clients had made as a gift. The Beaufort morning was warm and heavy with salt air from the river, and the sky was that particular shade of Carolina blue that makes you believe, against all evidence, that the world is basically good. Guests began arriving at 11. The rescue volunteers came first, wearing their Low Country Paws t-shirts, bringing 3 adoptable dogs on leashes who immediately became the center of attention. Then the clients. Families with kids, retirees with cat carriers, a man in a wheelchair who'd been bringing his German Shepherd to me since my 2nd month open. I knew every name. I knew every pet. I watched them filtering into the parking lot and settling at tables, and I thought, these people are here because I earned their trust one animal at a time, and my parents are on their way to stand in the middle of them and smile like none of it was ever in danger. The reporter from the Beaufort Gazette arrived at 11:30, a young woman named Jessie with a notebook and a photographer. She wanted background on the clinic. I gave her the version everyone knew, small practice, community focus, rescue friendly. She said she'd stay for the ribbon cutting. She had no idea what she was about to witness. The 2 board inspectors arrived at noon. I greeted them at the entrance, showed them my license on the wall, walked them through my controlled substance storage, answered their questions about my record keeping. One of them, a woman named Dr. Hargrove, nodded slowly as she reviewed my logs. She set her clipboard down and removed her glasses and said, "Dr. Flynn, your documentation is exemplary." She said it in the tone of someone who has seen the other kind, who has audited clinics where the logs are fiction and the substances are unaccounted for, and she recognized what meticulous looks like. I thanked her. I did not tell her what she was about to hear. My parents arrived at 12:15. My mother wore a peach-colored dress and her pearl earrings. My father wore a polo shirt and khakis, the casual uniform of a man who wants to appear relaxed. They walked in together, and I watched the room respond to them the way Beaufort always responded to Linda and Gerald Flynn, with warmth, with familiarity, with the unexamined affection a small town gives to people it has decided are good. My mother hugged 3 people before she reached the dessert table. My father shook hands with the man in the wheelchair. They took plates of cake and stood near the back of the gathering, and they looked to anyone watching like proud parents at their daughter's celebration. I stood behind the podium and watched them, and I felt something I want to name for you because I think some of you know it. Not anger, something colder. The specific, clear-eyed exhaustion of a person who has spent years performing the role of loving daughter to people who are actively working to destroy her, and who is standing in the last minutes of that performance knowing the curtain is about to fall. I was tired. I was tired, the way you're tired after 7 years of a fight no one believes is happening. But underneath the tiredness was something hard and bright and absolutely still. Resolution, not rage, resolution. The ribbon cutting was at 12:30. I thanked the community. I talked about Brutus, who sat beside the podium with his tail sweeping the ground, and I told the story of pulling him from the euthanasia list, a 3-legged dog no one wanted, and how he became the first patient and the permanent resident of a clinic that was built on the belief that everything deserves a chance, even the things other people have decided to throw away. People clapped. My mother clapped. I watched her hands come together, manicured nails catching the light, and I heard the sound of her applause, and I thought, those are the same hands that dialed the county licensing office. Then I said, I want to address some rumors. The shift was immediate, not in the crowd, in me. I felt my spine straighten. I felt my voice drop half a register into something that was not the cheerful veterinarian they knew, but the woman underneath, the one who had been quiet for 7 years. I saw my mother's hand stop midway to her mouth, a bite of cake suspended. I saw my father's chin lift a millimeter, the way an animal lifts its head when it hears a sound it can't identify. Some of you, I said, have received phone calls over the past 2 years. Calls from people expressing concern about this clinic, about my license, about my insurance, about whether your pets are safe here. I paused. The parking lot was quiet. 130 people holding plates and cups. The rescue dogs had stopped pulling at their leashes. Even the traffic on the road behind us seemed to dim. I want you to hear something. I want you to hear it for yourselves, because I've learned that in this town, the truth doesn't travel as fast as a concerned phone call from someone you trust. I picked up my phone. My hand was steady. I don't know how. Something in me had gone past shaking into a stillness that felt geological, like bedrock. I played the first recording, my mother's voicemail from November 2024. Her voice came through the event speakers with the clarity of a church bell. "Sweetheart, we are so proud of your little clinic. You're doing amazing." It hung in the air. Several people smiled. My mother, near the dessert table, smiled too, reflexively, the way you smile when you hear your own voice saying something kind. Then I played the second recording, the county licensing office call from January 2025. My mother's voice again, the same voice, the same woman but different, professional, clipped, purposeful. "I need to report that my daughter Denise Flynn is operating a veterinary clinic without current malpractice coverage. She's a liability to this community." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of understanding. 130 people processing the same realization simultaneously. The woman who had just been smiling at the sound of her own praise was the same woman who had called the county to report her own daughter as a danger to the community. My mother's face went white, not red, not the flush of embarrassment. White, the color of a person whose blood has made a decision before their brain has. She set her plate down on the dessert table. She did not pick it up again. I wasn't finished. I said, "This next recording was made from my clinic phone. I have a VoIP system that logs and records every call. My father used this phone during a visit and made a call to one of my clients." I pressed play. My father's voice filled the parking lot, warm, concerned, avuncular, telling my biggest sporting client that I practiced without insurance, that my coverage had lapsed, that she was putting her animals at risk. My father stumbled backward into the catering table. I don't mean he stepped back. I mean his body moved involuntarily, the way a body moves when the ground shifts, and his hip caught the edge of the table and the silverware rattled and a tray of finger sandwiches slid 6 inches to the left. He recognized his own voice. He recognized the call. And he recognized, in the same instant, that the phone system he didn't know existed had captured him in the act of lying about his own daughter to her own clients. His jaw moved, like he was chewing something, but his mouth was empty. I have replayed that image in my mind more times than I should admit. The working of his jaw, the silent grinding of a man trying to find words and finding nothing. His eyes moved across the crowd, looking for someone, anyone, who might offer him an exit. No one moved. I said, "My parents promised me a partnership in their practice 7 years ago. I left a full-ride residency at NC State to come home. They never added my name to anything. They billed $74,000 under my license and paid me $31,000 as a trainee. They used my DEA registration on controlled substance logs for procedures I never performed. They listed me on a loan application I never signed. When I left and opened this clinic, they called my clients, filed a false complaint with the state board from my father's personal email, and created a Facebook page warning Beaufort that my practice was under investigation." I said each sentence slowly. I let each one land. I watched the room receive each fact the way a room receives bad news at a town meeting, with a collective intake of breath that sounds like a room-sized sigh played backward. Some people were looking at me, some were looking at my parents, some were looking at the ground, which is where you look when reality is rearranging itself and you need a fixed point. The reporter, Jessie, had stopped writing and was holding her pen in midair. The photographer's camera was down at his side, forgotten. Dr. Hargrove, the board inspector, was standing near the clinic entrance. She reached for her clipboard. She did not write anything on it. She held it the way you hold something when you need your hands to have a purpose. If your own parents ever used your name, your license, your work to build something they told the world was theirs, and then tried to tear you down when you built your own, you're not ungrateful. You're awake. Tell me in the comments. Did you ever discover your family was billing the world for your labor? Then Mrs. Adwell stood up. She had been sitting in a folding chair near the front, Biscuit on a leash at her feet. She stood the way a 71-year-old woman stands when she has made a decision and her knees are secondary to the decision. She was holding a folder. She walked to the podium. I stepped aside. I did not know she was going to do this at this moment. We had discussed her statement, but not its timing. She chose the silence after my words the way a musician chooses the rest between notes. She faced the crowd. She opened the folder, and she said in a voice that carried across the parking lot with the authority of a woman who had spent 30 years speaking in county meetings, "My name is Lucille Adwell. I've lived in Beaufort for 43 years. Most of you know me. Some of you know I'm a member of Grace Lutheran, where Linda Flynn has served on the hospitality committee for 12 years. She paused. She looked at my mother. My mother was moving. She had turned and was walking toward the side gate, the gate that led to the alley behind the strip mall. Walking quickly, not running. My mother would never run. Running would be undignified, and my mother's dignity was the last weapon she had. Mrs. Adwell raised her voice, not shouting, projecting. "Linda, I called the board myself. Her license is perfect. Yours is the complaint they're investigating." My mother stopped. She was at the gate. Her hand was on the latch. She did not turn around. She stood there with her back to 130 people and her hand on a metal latch, and she did not move. The peach-colored dress hung perfectly. The pearl earrings caught the light, and for the first time in my life, I saw my mother without her performance, and what was underneath was not a villain. It was something smaller. A woman standing at a gate with nowhere to go. Mrs. Adwell continued. She read from the folder 22 signed statements from clients who had received false reports from my parents. She read the names, she read the dates, she read the specific claims that had been made. Mrs. Patterson was told Denise's facility failed inspection. It didn't. Mr. and Mrs. Okafor were told Denise's controlled substance license was revoked. It wasn't. Angela DeSoto was told Denise was dropped by her malpractice insurer. She wasn't. 22 names. 22 lies. Each one spoken aloud in front of a crowd that included the people who had been lied to. I watched the faces. I watched them the way you watch weather moving across water. Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 50s who had brought her 2 cats to me for 3 years, closed her eyes and nodded slowly. Her husband put his hand on her back. Mr. Okafor, a retired teacher, looked at my father with an expression I can only describe as disappointment made visible. The specific look of a man who has just learned that someone he respected did not deserve it. Angela DeSoto, who ran a dog grooming business 2 doors down from my clinic and had sent me more referrals than anyone in Beaufort, stood very still with her arms crossed and her chin raised and her eyes on my mother's back, and she did not blink. The man in the wheelchair, whose name is Carl and whose German shepherd is named Duke, said quietly to no one and everyone, I knew something wasn't right. His wife put her hand on his shoulder. Carl looked at my father, who was still standing against the catering table, and Carl shook his head once. Just once. The way you shake your head when you don't have words and you don't need them. My father's eyes found Kaylee. She was standing at the edge of the crowd near the street, and she was looking at her phone. She was already leaving. Not physically. But the way she held her phone, angled away from the scene, her face illuminated by a screen instead of by the reality unfolding 10 feet away, she was already gone. The rescue volunteers from Low Country Paws were standing in a cluster near the adoptable dogs. One of them, a woman named Terry, who had been volunteering with me since my 2nd year, was crying. Not for me. For the dogs my parents' clinic had been treating under my credentials without my knowledge. For the controlled substance logs that bore my name on procedures I never performed. For the animals caught in the middle of a family's lie. The silence held for what felt like minutes, but was probably 30 seconds. 30 seconds in which the social reality of that parking lot permanently shifted. The narrative that Beaufort had carried for 7 years, that Linda and Gerald Flynn were good people and their daughter was struggling, that narrative died in the open air between the podium and the dessert table, and it was replaced by something more complicated and more true. Dr. Hargrove put her glasses back on. She wrote something on her clipboard. Jessie, the reporter, began writing again. She filled 2 pages without looking up. My mother's hand was still on the gate latch. She hadn't moved. The photographer, apparently remembering his camera, raised it. But he didn't take the photo. He looked at my mother's back and he lowered the camera and he looked at me and I shook my head. No, that was not the image I wanted from this day. A woman's back at a gate. That was not victory. That was pain wearing a peach-colored dress. My father cleared his throat. The sound was enormous in the silence. Every head turned to him. He opened his mouth. He said, Denise. Just my name. And then nothing. The name hung there without a sentence to catch it. He looked at the ground. He looked at the sky. His jaw worked again, that chewing motion with nothing to chew. And then he turned and walked toward my mother at the gate. He did not look at anyone as he walked. He reached the gate. He put his hand on my mother's elbow. She flinched. They stood there together, 2 people in a parking lot full of witnesses, and I watched their postures and I understood that the performance was over and they had no idea what came after. The gate opened. They walked through. The gate closed behind them with a small metallic sound that I heard perfectly because everything else had stopped. I stood at the podium. Brutus was still beside me, his tail no longer wagging, but his body pressed against my leg. I put my hand on his head. His fur was warm. The sun was on both of us. And I said, "Thank you for coming today. The clinic is open for tours. There's cake." And I stepped down. The room exhaled, not a sigh, but a collective release. The sound of 130 people remembering how to breathe and speak and exist in a world where what they thought they knew had been replaced by what was actually true. Conversation started in clusters, quiet at first, then louder. People came to me. They shook my hand. They hugged me. Mrs. Patterson said, "I'm sorry I almost left." Mr. Okafor said, "My wife told me something felt wrong. I should have listened to her." Angela DeSoto looked at me and said nothing and squeezed my hand so hard my knuckles turned white, and that was better than any words. Mrs. Adwell sat back down in her folding chair and adjusted biscuit on her lap. I walked over to her. I said, "I didn't know you were going to do that." She said, "I wasn't sure I was either until I was." She looked at the gate my parents had walked through. She said, "I sat next to your mother at church for 12 years. She always smelled like lavender. And every time I hear lavender now, I'm going to think about this parking lot." She scratched Biscuit's ears. "Some things you can't unknow." The hours after the open house had a quality I'd never experienced in Beaufort. My phone began ringing before I'd finished cleaning up the catering tables. The first call was from a client of my parents, a woman named Sandra, who said, "I heard what happened. I want to transfer all 3 of my dogs to your clinic." The second call was from another client. The third was from a man I'd never met who said his neighbor had been at the open house and told him everything. 4 of my parents' remaining 6 clients transferred to my clinic within the week. 4 families, 12 animals, years of medical records that I received by fax from a practice that was now operating with 2 clients and a compliance audit. The audit was the thing that did the structural damage. The State Veterinary Board's mandatory compliance review found exactly what I'd reported. 5 years of controlled substance logs bearing my license number on procedures I never performed. Dispensation records I never authorized. DEA registrations used in my name without my knowledge. Within 60 days, my parents' clinic lost its controlled substance dispensing license. For a veterinary practice, that is not a setback. That is a death sentence. You cannot practice modern veterinary medicine without the ability to dispense controlled substances. No anesthesia. No post-surgical pain management, no end-of-life care. Their practice didn't close immediately, but the door was closing and everyone in Beaufort could hear it. My mother tried to control the narrative. She called members of the Church Hospitality Committee individually. She used the word misunderstanding repeatedly. She said Denise had always been emotional. She said the recordings were taken out of context, but context was exactly what the recordings provided, and every person she called had either been at the open house or had spoken to someone who was. The story traveled the way stories travel in small southern towns, through kitchen tables and parking lot conversations and the particular tone of voice people use when they say, "Have you heard about the Flynns?" Linda was asked to resign from the Church Hospitality Committee, not fired. Asked. The distinction matters because it tells you everything about how Beaufort handles its disappointments. They don't shout, they don't accuse. They create a silence around you and wait for you to hear what it means. The hospitality committee met without my mother for the first time in 12 years, and no one called to tell her when the next meeting was. My father's girlfriend left him. This was not directly because of the open house. It was because the loan fraud, my name on a mortgage application I never signed, became part of the board's investigation, and the girlfriend's daughter, Kaylee, the one who'd been introduced as the daughter joining the practice, suddenly found herself adjacent to a legal proceeding she wanted no part of. Kaylee's mother left my father on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Kaylee had removed herself from the practice's social media and changed her LinkedIn to reflect a job at a pet supply store in Charleston. The Beaufort Gazette published Jesse's article the following Wednesday. It was not sensational. It was factual. It reported the open house, the recordings, the board audit, and Mrs. Adwell's statement. It quoted Dr. Hargrove saying that the board takes complaints about credential misuse extremely seriously. It quoted me saying, "I built this clinic because I believe every animal and every professional deserves to be treated honestly." It did not quote my parents because my parents did not return the reporter's calls. The small business community in Beaufort is a network of interlocking loyalties, And when one node fails a test of trust, the network recalibrates. It does not do this with cruelty. It does this with the quiet withdrawal of presence that is worse than any accusation. My parents stopped being invited to the Beaufort Business Alliance monthly luncheon. Not banned, just not invited. Their Christmas card list, which I knew about because my mother once told me she maintained 300 addresses, that list became a measure of their shrinking world. People who had written Happy Holidays, Love to you both, for years simply stopped writing. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything people now knew and could not unknow. I processed all of this from a distance that surprised me. I expected satisfaction. I expected the hot, clean feeling of justice. Instead, I felt something more like a clearing, like a field after a controlled burn. The dead growth was gone, and what was left was exposed and raw and not yet green, but it was honest ground. It was the actual terrain of my life, not the landscaped version my parents had been maintaining for other people's benefit. The USB drive sat in my desk drawer at the clinic. I looked at it sometimes. It was a 16 gigabyte flash drive, silver, with a scratch on the casing from where I dropped it on the examination room floor the week before the open house. It contained 2 audio files that had dismantled a 7-year performance. It was the smallest thing in the room, and it had done the most damage, and I did not know what to do with it now that its work was done. I put it in the same drawer where I kept Brutus's original shelter paperwork, the form that said, unadoptable in red letters across the top. 2 pieces of evidence. One proved a dog was worth saving. The other proved a daughter was telling the truth. I kept them together because they belonged together. Mrs. Adwell came by the clinic the following Saturday, not for an appointment. She brought lemon squares. She sat in the waiting room with Biscuit and she ate a lemon square and she said, I want you to know something. The first time your mother told me you were desperate for clients, I almost believed her. That's the part that bothers me. Not that she said it, that I almost let it land. She looked at her dog. People like your mother count on almost. Almost believed. Almost didn't check. Almost looked the other way. The whole thing runs on almost. She finished her lemon square. I'm glad I checked. I am too. I am glad she checked. I'm glad she stood up in a folding chair with bad knees and read 22 names into a microphone. I'm glad she chose truth over 12 years of church friendship. And I'm glad that on a Sunday night when her dog was dying, I answered the phone and drove to the clinic in pajama pants, because that was the moment that made everything that followed possible. Not the recordings, not the board audit. A surgery at 2 a.m. for a 71-year-old woman's terrier, that was the seed. A month has passed since the open house. My clinic has 23 new clients. I hired a veterinary technician named Marcus who is better with nervous cats than anyone I've ever seen. I'm looking at a lease for the space next door, the sandwich shop that closed because I need a second exam room and a proper surgical recovery area. The strip mall landlord offered me a reduced rate. He said, "You're good for the block, Denise." He did not mention my parents. I drove past my parents' clinic last week. I did not intend to. My route home takes me past it if I don't take the bypass, and I forgot to take the bypass. The parking lot was empty. The sign still says Flynn Veterinary Associates, but the second floor office windows were dark, and the planter boxes by the front door, the ones my mother always filled with petunias in the spring, were empty. Brown soil and nothing growing. I did not stop. I did not slow down. But I noticed, and the noticing carried a weight I hadn't expected. I drove home that night and sat on the back porch of my rented house. Brutus came out with me. He has a particular way of settling beside me, turning 3 times on his 3 legs and then dropping with a sigh that sounds like a man taking off his boots at the end of a long day. He put his head on my knee. His ear was warm. The Beaufort evening was doing what Beaufort evenings do, going soft and gold and smelling like salt marsh and jasmine, and the insects were starting their noise, and the sky was turning the color of a bruise healing from the edges. I thought about calling my mother. I picked up my phone, I looked at it, and I put it down. Not from anger, from exhaustion, from the specific tiredness of missing people who may never have existed. The parents who called me our little doctor when I was 12 and let me stand on a step stool and watch a surgery. The mother who taught me to suture by practicing on a banana and laughed when I got frustrated and said, "Your hands will learn, sweetheart, trust your hands." The father who drove me to my first day of veterinary school and cried in the parking lot and thought I didn't see. Those people. Did they exist? Or were they another performance, a long-running one, a warmth sustained only because I hadn't yet become inconvenient? I don't know. And the not knowing is the grief I carry quietly, the one that doesn't have a name or a resolution, the one that sits in the same drawer as the USB drive and the shelter paperwork and the memory of my mother's perfume in a hug that might have been strategic. Brutus shifted on my knee, his tail thumped once against the porch boards. I scratched behind his ear, the left one, the one on the side where his missing leg used to be, the place where the phantom limb is, the place where something was and isn't, and the body remembers anyway. I used to think love was enough to make people honest. I was wrong. Love and honesty are different things. You can love someone and lie to them every day. You can build a family and a practice and a reputation on a foundation of love that has no truth in it at all. And when the truth finally arrives, it doesn't cancel the love. It sits beside it. Two things that should not be able to coexist, existing. What I know now is this. The truth doesn't set you free. The truth sets you loose. Free implies comfort. Loose is harder. Loose means you feel the wind. Loose means you have to build something new in the space where the lie used to be. But loose is real, and real is the only ground that holds. If you're listening to this and you're living inside someone else's performance, if you're the credential they bill under and the name they erase, if you're the labor behind someone else's reputation, I want to tell you what Mrs. Adwell told me that Saturday in the waiting room. The whole thing runs on almost. Almost believed. Almost didn't check. Almost looked the other way. The moment you stop being almost, the whole structure changes. This story has been told. One USB drive in a desk drawer, one three-legged dog on a porch, and one 71-year-old woman who stood up in a folding chair because she decided that almost wasn't good enough anymore. If you've ever had to choose between a family's version of you and the truth about yourself, I'd like to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Not for me. For the person scrolling right now who thinks they're the only one standing at the gate. Subscribe if these stories find you, and I'll see you in the next one.